everyone. I think we can go ahead and get started as it is now 2 o'clock. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Paulina Guzman. I am the Deputy Director for Diplomacy and External Affairs at the City of Atlanta Mayor's Office of International Affairs. I am so excited to be here participating in the World Languages Week Diplomacy panel today. I believe this is the last session, the last discussion of the week. So thank you to those who have tuned in with us and have participated in the events throughout the week, and for sticking around with us on a Friday afternoon. I promise we'll end the week on a good note. We'll have a really great discussion. So to get started, on behalf of the Center for Urban Language Teaching and Research at Georgia State University, I welcome you all to the 7th Annual World Languages Week. CULTR is one of 16 federally funded Title VI language resource centers in the United States. CULTR has created a unique identity around serving the needs of all students and the communities they represent by helping to promote language learning opportunities as part of 21st century global education. I'd like to go over just briefly a few housekeeping items before I introduce our panelists. First, I'd like to remind everyone that all panels this week are being recorded and will be available after the event. Attendees, please remain muted throughout the entire session. And we will also have a Q&A session towards the end of the panel discussion. So students and all audience participants, please submit your questions throughout the discussion. Feel free to do it, now if you have some preliminary questions. If anything kind of piques your interest from some of the comments the speakers make, just feel free to put it in the chat box. There's a chat icon or the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. If you like the questions that you see in the Q&A box, feel free to click the thumbs up icon so that you can promote the question to the top of the box. So now our speakers today are Ms. Elizabeth Blumenthal. She is the Deputy Cultural Affairs Attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw, Poland. Elizabeth is a Foreign Service Officer for the U.S. Department of State. We also have Mr. Todd Miyahira. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He is the Cultural Affairs Officer in the Public Affairs section at the U.S. Embassy in Brasilia, Brazil, also serving as a Foreign Affairs Officer for the Department of State, and Mr. Alan DuBose, Foreign Service Officer and Diplomat in Residence for the U.S. Southeast, also based in Spelman College currently. So thank you all for being here today. We truly appreciate the time that you've taken out of your busy schedules to join us this afternoon. I think we can go ahead and kind of get started in the discussion. You all may have noticed that I didn't recite your full background and professional experience, which I know you all have a significant amount of. And that's sort of because I wanted to sort of get right into the meat of the discussion. I wanted you all to sort of share with the audience about your experience, but not just outlining it. I'd like to kind of allow you all to talk about your diplomatic experience, but relate it back to what diplomacy is fundamentally. So to kind of set the stage a little bit for the audience, diplomacy, according to the U.S. Department of State, and of course there's many renditions of the definition, but it is essentially the management of relationships with foreign governments, international organizations, and people of other countries. The Webster Dictionary defines diplomacy as the art and practice of conducting negotiations between nations. And actually, I found a quote from a prominent economist and former diplomat during the Reagan administration, George Shultz, and he said, "Diplomacy is like gardening. You want to have a good relationship for the day that you will need it." And I really liked that. So I think maybe we can start off with Elizabeth, if that's okay. What are your thoughts on this? Tell us a little bit more about your experience and, tell us kind of the significance of why in the world's nations engage in diplomacy in the first place. Why is it so important?
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. And that's a great question to start off with. I think for me, and possibly I am biased because I am a public diplomacy officer, but for me, diplomacy is primarily about communication, communications between nations. And then those of us who work in embassies and consulates around the world are the communicators on behalf of the United States. And I think the reason that that's so important is that obviously, we all are living here on this earth together, and we need to be able to not just live together and coexist peacefully together, but especially in this day and age, we need to be able to work together to address common challenges that we all face, whether that is a pandemic or climate change or whatever the case may be. So for me, diplomacy is a way of communications. It is us learning about each other, learning about one another so that we can successfully work together. So as you might guess from my answer, I work in public affairs. So I'm currently in Warsaw, Poland, as Paulina said. And prior to this is actually my second time in Poland. I also have worked in Zagreb, Croatia, in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in Washington, D.C. And I have primarily focused on cultural and educational programs throughout that time. So you can see communications is very important to me. And that has involved anything from working on exchange programs to maybe bringing American speakers to Poland or Croatia or wherever I am to share best practices and learn best practices from people in the country they are visiting. And also bringing sort of examples of American culture, whether that is art or a dance company or a theater performance, things that we all share, things that are sort of universal. So I feel very lucky to have had the career I've had, and I hope you will all think about it after this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Elizabeth. And exactly. It's building the relationships. It's making those connections through communication and understanding. It's building curiosity between different countries. 100% agree. Alan, what about your experience with diplomacy? What is your perspective on its significance?
I think it's fantastic. We have a different distribution of foreign service officers sitting in front of you right now. I actually worked in the private world for over 17 years. And then one day I saw an ad by Colin Powell saying, we're looking for administrative people. And I thought to myself, I'm an administrative person. I'm an MBA business type guy. What does the State Department want with me? The Foreign Service, they don't want people like me. And I went to careers.state.gov, and that's when I started my research and learned that they actually do, because diplomacy has different faces. So you heard some of the PD version of diplomacy. I'm management. So how does diplomacy look for us? Real life, what it looked like was when I was in one country, I'll be careful not to say country names, and they decided they were going to do a construction project right in front of our building. And I was in another country where they make it worse. We had bought a building and they decided to run the subway under it. So we had some problems and we had to negotiate with those countries. Now, in one of those cases, they were pretty much going to do whatever we wanted because we were the big US government. Another one of those countries, they were going to do everything they could to keep from showing any prejudice towards us because we were the US government. So diplomacy for someone maybe like in these cases I'm saying is a management role is really trying to figure out how to get things done in your political environment. You can't just throw your weight around all the time, but at the same time, you don't want to not meet your goals. So essentially, if I had to wrap it up from the view of a management type person like myself, diplomacy is ultimately meeting the US foreign affairs goals. So all the other people who are working in that MC and PD or recon or whatever, they can get their work done as well. We have to take care of the umbrella so all the other roles can be filled.
Yes, exactly. And that's sort of kind of it kind of gives you also a clear indication, because I think people can get confused at times. Most diplomats are not policy makers. Some have had experience in policy making and legislation. They are implementers and facilitators. And some capacities, recommendations are made towards policy. But as you said, Alan, it's sort of meeting the foreign affairs goals on behalf of the country that you're representing. So absolutely. And I think you brought up another great point. To be a diplomat, you can also have, prior, private sector or NGO or public health experience. You can work for a variety of different sectors, a variety of different industries, and end up in working in diplomacy, because in many capacities they need individuals who have some expertise in specific areas of the economy as well. So it's something for students to know as well. You can start off in one career, and then if you find that you do have an interest in international relations and diplomatic work, there's always an opportunity there for you. So Todd, your role is primarily in public diplomacy. So, what would you say is the difference there? So there's public diplomacy, there's diplomacy. It's my understanding that public diplomacy falls kind of under this umbrella. How, in your perspective, how would you kind of dissect that?
Sure. Thanks, Melina, and good afternoon, everyone from lovely Brazil. I think my colleague Elizabeth and I, who both are public diplomacy officers, she's done a great job of, I think, explaining the ins and outs of the kinds of work that we do. But to differentiate it, I guess get to your question, I think we all traditionally think of diplomacy, as your definitions do, as one government talking to a foreign government, and that is traditional kind of diplomacy as it's been through centuries of nations. But as more and more countries have, of course, become democratic, and more countries are, therefore influenced by their publics, a lot of countries, and most countries, have realized that there needs to be, in addition to just elites talking to elites or governments talking to governments, there needs to be another part of that, in which governments are talking to foreign publics. And that's really all the great examples that Elizabeth raised. I mean, that's really what is at the heart of public diplomacy is, if instead of not just representing the United States government to a foreign government, not just talking to the foreign ministry or to the leadership of countries or to the elites of countries, which we do, of course, which is still really important because they are important parts of all countries. But in addition to that, we recognize that there is a lot of influence and power that comes, of course, from the general publics. And these general publics, especially in democracies, but in all countries, should have some knowledge of what the United States really is. They should have some knowledge of, what our culture is really like, not just hear one-sided opinions of what the United States stands for what its people are, and for what its, goals and dreams and hopes and values are. And so that's really kind of where public diplomacy comes in. We're trying to represent the United States, its people, its government to foreign publics in order so that they know us better, and that therefore we can work better together, not just with them, but also with their governments, because if they understand us, their governments are more likely to also want to work with us as well.
I completely agree with you, Todd. And actually, it's sort of, in a way, it kind of reminds me of what our office does at the Mayor's Office of International Affairs. We're not foreign service officers. We're not diplomats per se, but we sort of act as, the public affairs international ambassadors for the city of Atlanta, because we realize that, in many ways, diplomacy is about making those connections, as Elizabeth said, building those relationships. And as sort of ambassadors to the city of Atlanta, we want to make a great impression about Atlanta to international visitors, international businesses, dignitaries, individuals that are coming to the city to explore what our city has to offer, so that when they think about our city, or when they think about a destination to open up a business or a facility or what have you, they think about our city. And I think in many ways that sort of translates to what you all are doing in your respective countries and your respective roles. You are, building out this sort of, impression about the U.S., fulfilling the U.S.'s policy goals and international policy goals, but also kind of acting as the ambassadors to the public affairs, public diplomacy ambassadors of the United States. So great. So I think, so now that we've kind of addressed this kind of fundamental definition of diplomacy, its significance, its impact, the purpose of it, I'd like to kind of break it down a little bit. So I think students, and I think most people in general, aren't familiar with this kind of, mysterious world of protocol and diplomacy. And I say that because sometimes there seems to be, it can be a bit of like pomp and circumstance. It can be a little bit inaccessible. What's with all these titles? What is an ambassador? Why do we have to do these flag arrangements? It can be a little bit overwhelming and confusing. So I think it would be helpful if you all could demystify it a little bit for us. So Alan, you've had such a robust experience in many different capacities and as working as a foreign service officer. I'd love if you can sort of share with us, kind of break it down for us. What is a diplomatic mission? What's the difference between an embassy and a consulate? What does the leadership look like within both? And what is the role? What does each fulfill? What role does each fulfill?
Sure, Paulina. Yeah, putting everything in context kind of makes sense. It'll kind of bring a picture, and also you're going to understand a little bit. Whenever you watch the news and you see something going on and you say, why is the U.S. even there? Well, I'm going to answer that question right now. So let's start with the head. An official American, whenever someone's representing the U.S. government and they're abroad, that other country has to accept them. They have to say, we know you're here. We're giving you permission to be here representing the U.S. government. Now, there are other parts of the U.S. government who have their own agreements. The best known is DOD, who usually has a status of forces agreement, the military. But the others tend to fall under what we call the chief of mission. So this chief of mission is in control. Everybody else, one way or another, reports through this chief of mission. And 95% of the time, that's the ambassador. So the ambassador is the chief over the entire country when it comes to any official US Americans who are working in that country. Now, essentially, if we're in the private world, we call the chief operating officer, who the information goes through and the COO decides what's going to go to the ambassador. If it gets parceled out somewhere else, that's your deputy chief of mission. So you have your ambassador, who's also your chief of mission, and then your DCM, Deputy Chief of Mission, who's the equivalent of the COO. All right, so now that's the head. How are they organized? Keep in mind, I'm speaking generically, so not the details, because every post is a little bit different, but there are basically three broad ways they're going to be organized. One is going to be our section heads, and our section heads are going to be the people who are heading the sections of the U.S. Department of State. Those are going to be people like me in management, who handle management issues, political officers, econ officers, and these are what we call reporting officers. And when Elizabeth talked about the policy side, they tend to be the ones working with the governments on the policy issues and also back in DC. And I'm not going to talk about PD because we have PD people here, they can handle that. And then we also have the consular, and the consular I always call the retail. They're the ones who issue visas to have third country personnel enter the US, and they're also the ones who take care of the official American citizens if something happens when you're abroad. So that's one section. The other section is going to be the agency heads. I think economics is pretty important to the city of Atlanta, right? And the state of Georgia, and the US government and private. So foreign commercial service is overseas. They will put their own people overseas, but usually they report through the ambassador. They are trying to promote US business overseas. Agriculture, USDA, does the exact same thing. When I was in Dubai, USDA was huge because Dubai really doesn't grow a lot of anything. They import, so they wanted US products to be the ones that people thought of when they wanted to buy agricultural products. So there's an example of different agencies that you might not even know are there that are very important in the mission. And then the last one I'll talk about before I cede the floor is you asked about consulates. So in some countries where we have not only an embassy, but US government has some other issues that are important to us, we will put a consulate. And think of a consulate as pretty much a branch of that embassy. They don't have the full function of an embassy. They're there for a specific reason. In the old days, they were pretty much there just for consular services. That was really the purpose. But they've evolved now that they serve to provide whatever services are important in that country for the US government. So Todd's in Brazil, he's at Embassy Brazil, but Consulate General Rio de Janeiro, Consulate General Sao Paulo are going to report through the ambassador, the DCM to the ambassador, but they're all part of Mission Brazil.
Exactly. And Alan, and embassies are typically within the capitals of each country, or always within the capitals of each countries, but consulates can be around in various different cities in the country.
Yeah, the overwhelming majority, there are always exceptions to everything, but overwhelming majority of the time, the embassy is going to be in the capital. Sometimes there are political issues like in Israel, but in general, they're going to be in the capital. And as you said, the consulates have a reason they're there. So the most common reason that we are going to have a consulate is going to be American citizens are there. So they're Americans in Merida, in Mexico. So that's why you have a consulate there. The other most common reason is economics. That the same way everybody from another country is going to have a consulate in New York because that's the economic center of the United States. We tend to have consulates when we have countries where they have a New York version that really is the economic power versus the political power in that country.
Exactly. And one thing I don't think that was mentioned, but I think it's important for the audience to be familiar with are honorary consulates or honorary consuls. Would you be able to break that down a little bit for us as well?
Honorary consuls is more of a broad term. And so usually whenever there's an honorary consul, they have a specific reason that they're being chosen as an honorary consul for one specific issue, as opposed to someone who's going to be a career diplomat who is working their way up through the organization. An honorary consul may be chosen, I can't think of one in real life, but let's say there's an issue that has to be addressed at the UN, women's issues maybe. So you may have an honorary consul for women's issues at the United Nations, and they would serve that role. Those are more when we would see those situations. In general, when we're talking about career services, the consul general or consuls are defined by what we call our Vienna Convention, VCDR, Vienna Convention for Diplomatic Relations, which rules the rules and agreements for embassies, and our VCCR, Vienna Convention for Consular Relations, which is the set of rules for consulates.
Perfect. And thank you, Alan. I think that was a really good breakdown of sort of, what a diplomatic mission entails. What are the, what are kind of the mechanics behind it? Would Todd or Elizabeth, would you like to add anything else or supplement anything Alan shared?
I can go, Elizabeth. I don't want to step in front of you. I would just add to something I think that Alan laid out well and that you've already touched on, Paulina, is just the breadth of the kinds of work that these embassies do. And Alan mentioned I'm here in one of our largest diplomatic missions, the U.S. We call it the U.S. mission to Brazil, because it is, as Alan says, our embassy here in Brasilia, in addition to 4 consulates and an embassy branch office located throughout this country. And so, I mean, we're talking about 1,500 people, most of them are Brazilian, but 1,500 people working for the US government here in Brazil on a whole host of issues. And so, we're today representing the State Department, who's our home agency and the agency for, foreign service officers and traditional diplomats of the United States government. But if you look at kind of Mission Brazil, you could, even if your interest isn't eventually like straight international relations, diplomacy, education, diplomacy, all these things that can lead you into the Foreign Service, and those are all great things. Even if your interest is more specialized, there's probably a path still that will lead you at some point to have opportunities abroad in the U.S. government. So I'll just name a few of the more obscure ones that we have here in Brazil that, you know, I've never worked with before in other posts, but in a large mission we would have here. For example, we have here representatives from Atlanta, from the CDC, who work with you know, of course, our Brazilian colleagues on health issues. We have representatives from FAA here who work on, obviously, aviation agreements. We have a representative here from the Library of Congress. I have never seen that before, but somebody from the Library of Congress who is, you know, an accredited diplomat, you know, here in Brazil, working on actually a lot of what they do is looking for materials, right? Making sure that like the Library of Congress has the materials that it needs. And Brazil is such a large producer of texts, of course, that this is a great place for them to try to find. And they work regionally too, but also to find new acquisitions for the Library of Congress. The Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, APHIS, is here because, of course, we're doing a lot of agricultural exports. They need to make sure that the inspections that are going on, that are agricultural exports to the United States, are being inspected correctly. So I just say that as you can think of the really big agencies, state, commerce, ag, that USAID, you know, that Alan mentioned, but there are also very, very niche roles as well that you can find in some of these missions.
And if I can just tag on to what Todd said there, one other thing. So as Todd said, there are so many different ways if you want to work abroad in an embassy or a consulate. Alan and Todd and I are what are called generalists in the Foreign Service, although it's kind of a silly name because, as we just said, we all specialize in something. But whatever kind of skill you have, there is practically a job somewhere for you. Like, okay, Todd and I do the public diplomacy, so we're out like talking and doing culture and education, and Alan's working on dealing with some very tough sounding management issues. If you're someone who likes to write a lot, the political and econ officers, a lot of what they do is go out and have meetings with people and say, hey, what's going on with this? And then they write it up, send it to Washington. That helps make our policy. Those are some of the generalist jobs. We also have a whole other group of people called Foreign Service specialists, and they are our doctors. We have doctors at embassies, administrative people who we call them office management specialists, administrative assistants, I guess is a more general term for it. IT people, that's self-explanatory. Facilities managers who help us deal with all of the properties that the State Department has in its sort of purview around the world. And I am missing one. Oh, our security folks. We have security people, many of whom have a law enforcement background and then come over to the State Department. So there are just so many different kinds of jobs at embassies and consulates. You can find out about all of them, of course, at careers.state.gov. And I did not mean to sound like a commercial, but I realized I just did. So, but just putting it out there, something for everybody.
Not at all. And I'm glad you outlined it as well, because you know, that's something that, you know, it's interesting to share for students so that they kind of have the, you know, idea that, you know, there are a lot of different sectors that you can have experience in, and then also work in an international affairs space as well. You know, like Todd said, plant science, aviation, library science, so all sorts. There's a lot of opportunities, and I can post the website in the chat box as well. So let's shift gears here a little bit. I wanted to kind of talk more about you know, you all personally, your personal perspectives on different aspects of your roles. So Todd, you know, a component of becoming a Foreign Service officer is language training, from my understanding. And becoming a diplomat in general, it usually comes with the understanding that you are going to be learning the language of your posting, or learning a language, another language than your birth language. So now that you're posted in Brazil, I assume that you've had to, you know, use the Portuguese language to engage in you know, business relations and diplomacy and just fulfill the duties of your mission. You know, can you just sort of tell us what are the benefits of learning a foreign language and how, how does it enable, or how can it enable you to do work in a variety of different fields?
Yeah, sure. Let me start by, yes, putting a plug in for the State Department, because we have one of the most amazing benefits of being paid to learn languages at times. As we rotate around the world, at times the State Department will send us back for language training to Washington, because they know how important learning the local language is for the jobs that we're trying to do. I mean, Elizabeth and I, obviously, who work primarily in trying to communicate to foreign publics, obviously it makes sense that you need to be able to speak the language and understand the language, right? Just to listen and understand what people are saying as well. But even in across the board, having at least some understanding of the language is an incredibly important part to understanding the culture. And really what we're doing, right? The reason that we send diplomats abroad isn't just because we like to have people close to the seats of government. It used to be, right, when diplomacy began and communications technologies weren't what they were, you needed to literally have people physically in places to communicate. Now, right, we don't necessarily need to do that. Presidents can call each other, foreign ministers can call each other, they can Skype each other. I'm talking to you right now from Brazil. But the reason we still maintain this large apparatus is because we need people on the ground to understand the culture and understand what's actually happening in the country, things that you cannot just gain from reading the news or talking to people on the telephone. You need people who are immersed in the country and in the culture to actually understand what's happening, and to be able to take that understanding and communicate it on behalf of the US government and the people of the United States to a foreign public. And so learning a language is absolutely essential to our work, but also essential, I think, to so many different avenues. And I'll just say, or so many different pursuits. I mean, a lot of the people that we run across here abroad, who are Americans who are abroad here for other reasons, whether they're pursuing education, whether they're pursuing business, whether they're here even simply for tourism, understanding even the basics of a language will ingratiate you, first of all, so much to the local public that even speaks English, right? Even if people speak English, the idea that Americans are trying to speak their language, trying to communicate to them on their level, makes a huge difference in how they will respond to you usually. But even more than that, it's very, very, very difficult to understand, I think, to truly understand a culture without being able to a lot of culture you can learn through the language itself, right? I mean, learning language is learning how people right. phrase things, how people construct even their syntax. Gives you windows into the way that they think and why people from different cultures think differently. So, I mean, I guess that's a long-winded way of saying it's an incredibly important part of our work, of course, but I think it's an incredibly important part of a lot of positions that require people to find commonalities with people around the world. I mean, in this global world, having some ability to do that is absolutely crucial to connecting with people abroad. Even though more and more people are learning English all the time. So, I mean, it's incredible to go abroad and have so many people speak English to you. At the same time, it's not the same. You will not get the same level of closeness, or even I guess you won't be able to connect at the same level without at least some understanding of the language.
I 100% agree. I at the mayor's office, me personally, we're big advocates of language learning, even if it's just conversational, even if it's just a bit, because as Todd said, again, fundamentally, it's about making those connections, about building those relationships. And, the fact that, one has taken the time to learn a few words here and there, allows you, it's mutually beneficial, because, it reinforces, the relationship, but then it also allows one to, have a better understanding, as Todd said, of the society, the culture. I'm a Spanish speaker, so I know that there's certain things that you can say in Spanish that are so much more expressive and so much better. It just holds more weight. The words hold more weight in some ways, and then in English, it holds more weight in other ways. So exactly, just finding these commonalities. So, Elizabeth, so your role, you are engaged in public diplomacy, but you are also engaged in cultural affairs as the Deputy Cultural Affairs Attaché. And in this role, you're sort of seeking to enhance the cooperation between Poland and the United States in various capacities. Whether it's through programming, whether it's through policy recommendations, and you've had some experience living and working in Poland. So I'm just sort of curious, what have you seen, that is uniquely interesting and inspiring about the Polish culture? And then maybe what's something that maybe you sort of struggle to adapt to?
Well, yeah, I feel so lucky to be in this job. I think nothing personal, Ellen, but I think we work in the best section. So I love what we do so much. And I think I always say that when school groups come in, I'm like, don't tell the political section. Diplomacy is the best.
Yeah.
But I love it because we work on a little bit of everything. So all those kinds of programs I mentioned, like exchanges or dance performances or workshops in coding or whatever, everything we're doing is aimed towards promoting our goals in that country, whatever they are. So it's really cool because we get to do a little of everything and we're supporting everything else that happens in the embassy with our work. So this is a great thing. And it also gives you a chance to interact with so many different kinds of people, like young people, just, not like fancy government people, just like regular people and students. And that's where I really find inspiration. But Paulina, if you don't mind, I'm going to broaden your question out a little bit.
Sure, please.
I was trying to think about my career and I was like, what's been the most inspiring thing? And I actually would sort of go back one tour to my my time in Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The people in the capital city in Sarajevo, they lived through a siege of that city that lasted for 4 years in the 90s. And like terrible. I mean, like you would leave your house and people would be shooting at you. This is just in the 90s. And probably a lot of you were not born yet then, but to me, that feels so recent. People bombing the city from the hills around the city. There was a shortage of water. There was no electricity. There was not a lot of food and medicine. But people were so resilient there. People found ways to survive and to there's a whole exhibit at a museum there about all the different things people invented to sort of make it possible to go on living in some kind of semi-normal fashion, like making generators out of bikes so they could hear the radio and know what was going on. All the weird things people made out of the cans that the food aid got dropped in. And I found that resilience so inspiring. And people still talk about it all the time because you walk around Sarajevo and there are bullet holes on all the buildings. There are marks where grenades hit. And people live with this every day, but they have found a way to be resilient and live their best life regardless. And I found that super inspiring. In terms of things that are a little bit frustrating, I mean, to me, I'm going to tell you a silly one, but this is the charm of living overseas is there's always this weird stuff where you're just like, why Poland? So in Poland, both of my tours, Poland has an obsession with people having exact change. So you go to a store and
that's something that you would only know by living there. Yeah.
Exactly. It's so weird, but we all notice it. And now you can pay with cards. So it's less this way. But the first time I served here, no one took credit cards. So you would take something up to the register and it would be here it's zloty and grosze, but so let's say dollars and cents. It would be $5.83. And the lady would be like, do you have 83 cents? And be like, no, I don't have 80. Do you really not have 17 cents to give me back? I have to come up. I do not have 83 cents. And it was just this constant thing where I was like, is there a shortage of coinage in Poland? I don't understand. But so sometimes frustrating, but mostly it's just silly. Funny story for later. But I came back to the States right after that. I remember going to Rite Aid and I was like, oh no, I only have a $20 bill. And I was like, oh, I'm in America. Doesn't matter here. They'll just give me change. It'll be fine.
Exactly. That is so great. I love hearing that. I love hearing that story. Well, good. And thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth. So I think we're getting kind of closer to the end of the discussion. I want to make sure that we have kind of an overarching question, specifically related to students as they're navigating their careers before we go to the Q&A. So, again, ultimately the session is for students. They're kind of navigating their potential career prospects and just sort of trying to decipher, how they can utilize language, and cultural competency and just, the classes and courses that they've been taking as a transferable skill. So I think, and this is a question for all of you, knowing what you know at this stage in your career, what would you have wanted to know as a high school or college student, that would have helped you prepare for your role that you currently hold, or just sort of any career experience that you have had, so that students can sort of better prepare themselves and kind of have this idea, in advance.
If I can jump in quickly, because I did want to
Please.
emphasize one thing to kind of answer that question, or at least create a framework.
Please.
Ultimately, we're looking for people who are good all around. We call it the 13 dimensions. So if you go to careers.state.gov, and I'm going to encourage every student to go to careers.state.gov. It's an excellent site. And pretty much everything that came out of our mouths, except for the personal stories, you can find at careers.state.gov. So when you look at these 13 dimensions, they really identify things like leadership, judgment, communication skills, cultural adaptability. How well do you do when you're taking out of an environment you're familiar with and plop somewhere that you're very unfamiliar with? Do you crash and burn, or do you flourish? Basically, my point is that the expectation is not that you're going to get top heavy in one thing. You speak 3 languages, but then you have no cultural adaptability. That's not going to help us. The analogy I always make is a bodybuilder. It doesn't do any good to have big biceps and skinny legs. You have to be good at everything. So the one thing I would say to students early on, high school or in college, is don't get too narrowly focused thinking, oh, I need languages or I need this specific major. Now, you will need a specific major if, like Elizabeth said, you're looking at some of the specialist positions, which are like a facility manager, diplomatic security, some of those things. And again, you can find the difference at careers.state.gov. But if you're looking to be a generalist, the classic diplomat you see on TV, the expectation is that you're going to have to be kind of plug and play. So if we need Todd to do some political work, or Elizabeth to do some consular, Elizabeth did consular, Todd did consular. So we all have to be able to be more general. And so that's what I would say to students is step 1 is recognize that you have to be all around as opposed to just narrowly focused. And you can find some details at careers.state.gov called the 13 dimensions.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Alan. I think that's super helpful, and it's a great resource for students to have. I believe CULTR coordinators have posted it in the chat box as well if you wanted to take a look. What about you, Todd? What do you think? What would have helped you if you had in high school or a college student that you wish you would have known?
Yeah, I really like Alan's response, because I will say that I was probably a poster child for being too focused. So I'm one of these not strange, but I'm one of these people who thought about this career at a relatively young age and ended up actually doing it, which was amazing. So I thought about this. My dad brought home a book when I was in high school that was about, I'd asked him to get it from a bookstore in Washington about careers in international relations. And I read about the Foreign Service and I fell in love, and I was like, all right, this is what I'm going to do. So but I would say that I kind of heavily specialized. So I went to a school that focused on international relations at Georgetown, and then I entered at a fairly young age. And in some ways, and that's obviously, I've loved my career. I've been very fortunate to find a career that I love. But at the same time, I work with incredible colleagues, Elizabeth and Alan among them, who have brought so much more experience before they joined the Foreign Service into this world that I think And sometimes I feel like if I had branched out more, I'd be an even better rounded officer. And I've kind of grown up from as a relatively young age, like I said, in the Foreign Service. And sometimes I look back and wish I had a little more broader. I mean, I had some international experience, of course, and I did a little bit of work before I started, but not much. And I think I don't want to offer Elizabeth's complete backstory, but I mean, she has an incredible background before the Foreign Service. And my first job, as Alan mentioned, we often work consular work. In my first job in Honduras, when I was working the consular line, I was there as like a 24-year-old next to a guy who had been a sports producer for ABC Sports for like 12 years. And he was the most fascinating person that like I had ever met in my entire life. And it was just an honor to be working with him. And he brought so much more, I think, experience to that job. And on the other side was a woman who was on, actually kind of in her third career, but had worked as a university international relations person for over 2 decades. And she brought so much, an incredible experience. I learned so much from them, just from my colleagues who had all this experience, that I kind of wish I had more. But I mean, I don't want to set you up, Elizabeth, to talk about your background, but
it's such a perfect segue that I can't resist it. But Todd and I have worked together, and I don't think there could be a more well-rounded Foreign Service officer. But where Todd and I worked together was in Washington, D.C. So we also, none of us mentioned this, but of course there are jobs in Washington, D.C. As well at the State Department. And we worked in like this thing called the Operations Center, which is like, we call it the 24-hour nerve center of the State Department. So that makes it sound slightly more glamorous than it actually is when you work all night and drink a lot of coffee, but there we were. And when we were there, so I was, what Todd was alluding to is I started off as an actor. So I did that for 12 years and then went to grad school and joined the Foreign Service. Also with us in the Operations Center was our colleague Linda, who was a former flight attendant. Another colleague, Maria, who was like a major record, she was like research and development, whatever, right?
Yeah, so she was the record. Yeah, she was at Sony. Yeah.
I mean, and she knows all, like she's still on Facebook. She's always posting pictures of herself with like the Beastie Boys and stuff from back in the day. So people can come in with all kinds of backgrounds, truly. I know lawyers, I know teachers. And the great thing about the Foreign Service, you don't have to have, I see someone asked a question about, do I need to study international studies? Study whatever you think is interesting, because we need all kinds of people. I mean, technically speaking, you don't even have to have a college degree to take the Foreign Service exam. It's nice to have a college degree, of course, but if you pass the different steps of the Foreign Service exam, you are in, and we welcome people from all different backgrounds. As students right now, I would say one of the best things you could do is, I'm sorry if any of your parents are not into this, but think about some kind of exchange program where you go overseas for a semester or for a year in high school or in college. Our friends at CULTR posted like a bunch of links. There are exchange programs at all different levels. You learn so much living overseas, not just about the culture and stuff, but like about yourself, because you figure stuff out. It's very empowering. And I still feel that way at my age. Like I make dumb mistakes in Polish all the time and I don't care. I mean, I just figure it out and you make it work. And then you're like, oh my God, I did it. I figured out how to get my tires replaced speaking Bosnian, or whatever it is that you have to figure out. It's super empowering. And even if you decide not to go on to a life in diplomacy, that experience will really affect the rest of your life. So that's one huge piece of advice I would give to anybody thinking about this kind of career now.
Thank you. No, I think all of your comments were perfect. I completely and 100% agree. Definitely, there's a lot of opportunity and really whatever you're drawn to kind of go towards that, and there will be an opportunity for you. Very nice. So I think now I think we only have about 12 minutes left for Q&A. But we'll be able to do it. No worries. So we have such great questions actually in the Q&A right now. I think I'll just kind of go and start to select some of the ones that have been voted up towards the top. So it looks like a couple of the students are sort of interested in kind of getting a better understanding between the intersection of, I guess, foreign service and politics and sort of the change of administration throughout a career in foreign service or a career in diplomacy, and how that how that translates or how that shifts your roles or your priorities. If you all could kind of illuminate us a little bit on that, and if you've had experience in that, and how you kind of adapt to changes in administrations depending on the party, anything related to that question.
I can fill that one if you like.
Sure.
Keep in mind, I worked for 17 years in private industry. I worked for IBM, I worked for Digital Computer, a company called Rhythm LLC, another company that was bought out by what is Bloomberg Financial. And you know what we did? We did what the president of the company wanted us to do. We did whatever the mission of that company was. So that was our charge. Our military pretty much follows the policy that is set by the US government. We're no different. And so essentially, when we get the political questions, I usually lead with the private world first, because it's people many times look at TV and they think that government is so different. When in reality, the structure is pretty much the same concept, that decisions that are made at the top trickle down throughout the organization, and the people who are within that organization execute based on whatever that policy is of the leadership. It might be a board of directors or it might be Congress, but whatever that leadership is, that's it. So one thing I will say is that we in the Department of State represent positional authority, meaning that it's not the individual who carries the authority, it's the position therein that carries the authority. So we do whatever our responsibilities are based on the role and the position of the people who have the authority to do so. And the great thing is, this is actually documented, what we call our FAM or our FA, which are guiding documents. That's public information that shows the delegation of authority. So people clearly know who has the right and responsibility to speak for their superiors.
Perfect. Todd, I see you unmuting.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on this?
The only thing I'll add to it, I mean, Alan's completely right, of course. You know, we, our job as diplomats abroad is to fulfill the U.S. foreign policy as dictated by the leadership, the democratically elected leadership of the U.S. government. That's our job. But I will say, that I think a lot of what you see in the news, or there are of course policy changes as administrations change. That's inevitable. But at the same time, on the ground, a lot of the policies that we pursue on a country-to-country bilateral basis are relatively less volatile than I would say our domestic politics are, right? So a lot of things, of course, some policies will change, but a lot of it will be the same. A lot of it will change sort of incrementally or evolutionarily, because our relationships with these countries, in Brazil is almost 200 years long. It's the relationship itself is what we're looking after, and it changes, but it changes slowly, and it doesn't necessarily take dramatic turns, no matter who's elected in Washington or who's elected here in Brasilia. So yes, there are policy changes that all foreign service officers, all diplomats abroad have to adapt to. But then a lot of the work that I think a lot of the things that you don't see is that a lot of the continual work is not as volatile. It continues kind of on a normal basis. I mean, the stuff that Elizabeth and I work on, a lot of cases, right? Educational exchanges. There's no huge change in what we do from one administration to another. Even like development policies, or here in Brazil, environmental policies. Yes, there's a greater focus on it now with the Biden administration, but USAID has been working here in the Amazon for decades, right? So I mean, it's not like we're all of a sudden, focused on one particular thing. There's been people working here for decades on these issues, and so they may have greater focus or not, but a lot of the work continues, I think, despite changes in administration.
Exactly. And it's funny that you're mentioning this. It sort of translates at the city level as well, regardless of the new administration, whether it's from the same party or otherwise, we do have, a mission and a vision for, to oversee and to advocate for, highlighting the city internationally. And, although sometimes the mandate is adjusted a little bit depending on the administration, ultimately, it's the same goal. So I think that those are great responses. I'd like to just ask a question. There's a question in the chat box that I think is interesting because I don't think we've really addressed this part about it, but this is sort of a question related to sort of the kind of the mobility aspect of being a diplomat and the amount of times you have to sort of move postings. So the question is, you know, how do you deal with the challenges of living in a new country with your family, you know, moving to a new post every few years? Because just so that the audience has some context, typically a diplomat has a posting in a different country. I think they're usually there for about 2 to 3 years, 3 years or so. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I can start off with that because I made a big mistake my first tour here in Poland, and like I loved Poland so much. And so the last like whole year that I was here, I was like, oh, this is the last Christmas I'll ever spend, and this is the last time I'll see the lilacs bloom. I only have 7 more dance classes before I leave Poland. So I was like really sad for, you know, a year. So I don't do that anymore. I just try to live in the moment and enjoy where I am. But you know, it is hard, and it gets a little harder as you do it more times because like look at all this stuff. You have to pack up all this stuff, and your apartment's empty for the last, you know, 2 month and of each tour in the first month of the next one. And that is tiring. On the flip side, you get to discover a new country and a new city and new people every 2 to 3 years. And that is very awesome. Like if you think that you like that, you will deal with all of the moving. So that, you know, there's good and bad of everything. And those are the 2 sides of the coin, I think, for all the moving. So I will leave it. That's a short answer. I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So I think we might have time for just one more question, and then I'll go ahead and close it out. We can do a nice quick one, maybe a rapid fire. So I have a question up here. Across all of your travels in these roles, what has been your favorite place? What made it special to you? I know that's probably a lot of a larger answer than the time we have, unfortunately, but anything you'd like to share?
I'll share real quickly. I had a job that was actually based in the US, but I was traveling throughout Latin America. So I got to visit a lot of countries in Latin America over 2 years. And that was actually the most fun job I have had when I've been in the US Foreign Service, because I wasn't just staying in one place doing one thing. A characteristic you'll see with a lot of us is we just like change. We just like doing something different. The grass is always greener to us. And here was a job where I was going to almost 80% of the Latin American countries I had a chance to visit. So the many experiences I got from each one of those was just fun. It was a lot of fun.
What about you, Todd? What do you think?
I'll go super quickly. One, it's a very dangerous question to ask a diplomat what their favorite country is, because
I
the answer has
know.
to be the country where they are right now. But so I will pick a domestic one to get out of that question. No, I will also say, and because I didn't mention this earlier, Elizabeth mentioned that we worked together in a place called the State Department Operations Center. That was an amazing job. It was an amazing opportunity to work with great people and in a really fast-paced kind of like center of policy kind of job. And I went from that job to work for a year in the White House Situation Room as well, doing a similar job, which was also similarly incredible. I worked with an interagency team, also 24-hour shifts, but got to work, you know, with military intelligence, law enforcement folks, all on the same team, doing very similar work of, you know, just making sure that our leadership was aware of all the breaking events that were happening in the world. And that was an incredible experience.
I will go so fast. This is gonna sound like a cop-out. It's not. Wherever I am. Wherever I am. I love it. I love wherever I am. I make the most of it. And
A very diplomatic answer.
That's the way to, but it's true.
It
And
is
that's the way
true.
to live life. Like make the most of wherever you are and enjoy it.
Agreed. I think that was wonderful. Thank you all so much. I think, you know, I could talk for so much more time with you all. I think we've had such a good time, so much fun speaking to you all. I hope the audience members have enjoyed this session. I think we can conclude today's diplomacy panel. I have learned so much about you all, your experience. I've learned new things about diplomacy. I've learned new things about the work of diplomatic affairs, the work of public diplomacy, all of your experience. And I hope the audience who's listening in today have really can have important takeaways that they can utilize as you navigate your careers, as you explore opportunities, as you kind of make decisions about what major you want to be or just what you want to do in your life. I'm still figuring that out. I think all of us are sort of doing that constantly. So, but thank you again, everyone. I do have a couple of closing statements that I would like to make. Of course, on behalf of CULTR, thank you for joining us. A reminder that all of these panel discussions are recorded and can be available to view after the event. I invite you also to complete a post-event survey after the Zoom session closes. And of course, again, as I mentioned, this is the final discussion of World Languages Week, and I think we hit the ball out of the park. I think we had a really fun, engaging discussion, so thank you all again for that. And again, as part of International Education Week, the Global Career Series provides an opportunity for attendees to learn about global organizations and careers and internship opportunities. There is an event, I believe that will be coming up soon. So I encourage you all to visit the CULTR website to get more details on that, and by clicking the registration link in the chat. And I think that's all I need to say on behalf of CULTR. And thank you all again. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Alan, for your participation. Thank you to the folks at CULTR and to the audience members and the students who tuned in on a Friday afternoon. And please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any additional questions. We would be happy to share with you everyone's email address and any other resources that you may need. With that, I think we can say goodbye. Thank you all.